Hello everybody, this is Seth Choggy, and thank you for registering for the Endless Forms seminar series hosted by the Cambridge University Biological Anthropology Society, an independent student-led society dedicated to human origins research. We offer a warm welcome to Professors Lee Berger, Agustin Fuentes, and John Hawkes. Dr. Lee Berger is the Philip Tobias Chair in Paleoanthropology at the University of Witwatersrand. Dr. Agustin Fuentes is Professor of Anthropology at Princeton University and formerly the Chair of Anthropology at Notre Dame. Dr. John Hawkes is the Vilas Borghese Distinguished Achievement Professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. All three professors have contributed significantly to our understanding of human origins, ranging from the socio-ecology of island langurs and the evolution of human population size, to the shoulder girdle of hominins and the discovery and description of multiple new hominin species. So I would like to thank everyone for coming and joining, and especially the professors who I will now hand it over to. Thank you.
We decided this is an interesting group, and thank you for inviting us to this type of lecture, some of my favorite types, speaking to the next generation and early career scientists, particularly as they emerge into a field that is perhaps the most exciting moment it's been perhaps in its history. And I don't say that lightly now. We have for the first time the ability to combine the discoveries of fossils, which we are finding at, I think, a unprecedented rate, a rate that for those of us who've been in this field more than about 15 or 20 years would have thought absolutely impossible just 15 years ago, to the addition of discoveries that molecular biology are bringing to that, and including and allowing us to dig deeper into the past. But also we mustn't forget new ways of looking at things. Now, I'm not talking just about technology here. It seems that this generation and generation of explorers that are active out there have had their eyes open. They see greater possibilities now. They're seeing things that others missed. And I think that has been a critical theme in the last several years of the Rising Star Project, which is going to be what we focus on today, and particularly Homo Naledi, of beginning to see things that others had missed in the past, but also that our own teams have missed, and they're going to have dramatic effects on it. The Rising Star team that studies Homo naledi that we're going to talk about today has its origins, of course, in the 2013 expedition of that name. It actually, though, extends earlier than that to the 2008 discovery of Sediba, and the team that grew out of it now studies, the global team that studies Homo naledi, that grew out of those projects into team now numbers well over, I was doing a count today, over 160 active scientists that work from all over, from more than 40 institutions around the world. To give you some idea of the scale of this project, I think it may in fact be the largest project in the field of paleoanthropology in history, and ranks amongst some of the larger scientific projects. And it's growing every day. It's growing as we make discoveries, or as scientists collaborate with us, bringing forward new technologies and new ideas to us. I am going to say this before I introduce how we're going to carry on with this in this seminar. We have made new discoveries. We've made significant new discoveries. Some of them several years ago, and some of them very, very recently. And I suppose that's part of the reason the three of us are presenting here today, because of those more recent discoveries. While I can allude to these discoveries right now, we are obviously respecting the peer review process that's underway, as well as the publication process in peer-reviewed journals. But we're hoping that for at least the beginning of this, what is going to be an avalanche of, and I don't use these words lightly, extraordinary discoveries over the next months and years to come that are coming out of this project around Homo naledi. It's an astounding species. It's a primitive species in many ways, yet it sits, of course, in a temporal position that's out of time and place for a species with that morphology. When we initially announced Homo naledi, we did not have a date on it. We chose to announce it based on its morphology as a new species. And it was described as a species that in many ways is one of the most primitive members of the genus Homo ever described. You could argue that in some ways it's more primitive than Homo habilis. It's certainly more primitive than most examples, if not all examples, of Homo erectus. And yet it sits at about 220 to 330,000 years on the present dates that we've presented. And that is smack in the middle of a temporal period when, up until this discovery, we thought that Homo sapiens was alone on Africa, either an archaic version or the emergent version of what is, I think, wrongfully called often modern Homo sapiens, or anatomically modern Homo sapiens. I don't like those terms, but we can maybe discuss that a little bit, and shocked a lot of us, including most of the team at that time when those dates came through, and we're still trying to process its place, its position, where it comes from phylogenetically, how it fits into our family tree. We've been very conservative in not pigeonholing our group into trying to, just put our mark on where it fits, because I think that with the enormous diversity of hominids that we've discovered in the recent past, and the numbers and quality of hominids, including skeletons, that we thought we'd probably never get, we understand that that can be a fool's errand in this stage, and that it should be perhaps more caution should be used. So what Augustine, John, and I discussed is we thought this would be an exciting time, not to give you just a traditional lecture and show you slides and stuff. We thought we'd have a conversation. Not surprisingly, or it may surprise you, teams like ours disagree on a lot of things. We don't have often clear ideas, even those of us who work very closely with each other and work continuously with us. And so what we thought is we'd have a conversation allowing each of us to ask questions of each other that will lead to conversations and they'll introduce each time as they do that, or we'll introduce why we're asking that question and place that question in context about Homo naledi that we feel are critical things that can lead to really interesting sort of rabbit holes that you'll probably find we may not have gone down in some places, but we're willing to go down, hopefully today, as far as we can into those rabbit holes while being kind to each other at the same time. And so to that, I'm going to introduce Agustin Fuentes. Augustine, I've known him for years, but we've started working together based on some of these new discoveries, and he was present on a recent expedition. So he's been in the cave and has become intimately involved in the Homo naledi project, and comes from a very different background to the rest of us. And I'm going to let him talk to why he's part of the team, which will be not count as one of my questions, and then let him kick off the Q&A. It's your floor, Augustine.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us in here, and thanks to everyone for attending and listening and then participating with us in this endeavor. I think one of the most important things for me, at least, thinking with the contemporary approaches to human evolution, are the challenges that are in front of us, as Lee identified, over the last 2 decades or so, with the radical expansion, not just of fossil material, but of opening of new sites, of broader technologies, and of this ability to think evolutionarily, to sort of move beyond a morphometric or a pure measurement component, to think in these incredible dynamics, to reconstruct ecologies, and to create evolutionary narratives of the lives of the hominins in ways that we weren't able to before. And that frame, right, this place we are in the current moment with evolutionary biology, with technology, with the sort of pace and pattern and practice of paleoanthropology, leads us to an interesting sort of set of problems, right? Because we all, I was trained in this context 30 plus years ago, right? Or 30 years ago. And what I was told, what I learned about the way hominins evolved over the Pleistocene in particular, and in the Pliocene, but in the Pleistocene genus Homo, the way in which genus Homo and other hominins evolved in this time period had a sort of fixed nature to it. It was sort of set. We had a general idea. We thought we understood pretty well how things are going. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen that every one of those major assumptions challenged, or at least the majority of them. And I'd like to suggest that the contemporary challenges are epitomized when we think about Homo naledi, what's already been published and what's coming, because it does a number on our major assumptions. I think there are assumptions about what a member of the genus Homo should look like, particularly in the Middle Pleistocene, what kind of behavioral life ways, what kind of behavioral ecological profiles they should have. There's what size brains they should have. There's a number of sort of just confounds to our general story, to our narrative, that are in front of us today. And so I would like to ask Lee and John a particular question, because one thing in reviewing the literature for a number of overviews over the last decade or so that has really jumped out, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, is how many major revisions, major sort of statements about innovation, about understanding, about human evolution have appeared in the literature. And yet rarely do most of those engage with the confounds that Naledi introduces. Usually Homo naledi is sort of mentioned, but not centered as part of the sort of robust data set that occurs, particularly for the Middle Pleistocene. And so my question to Lee and John here is, A, why is that? Why is Naledi not more part of this discussion from their own perspectives? And B, how should we be thinking about Naledi in relation? And they've written, co-authored some, along with many colleagues, a few pieces that make an argument for why Naledi might be more central to hominin evolution, and might tell us some things about human evolution that we'll get to later. So Lee and John, why is it Naledi front and center in some of these narratives? And I guess B, why should it be?
You start, John.
Well, I'll tell you what my opinion about this is. My opinion is that our field is very conservative. And we're not conservative because we're committed to ideas from the past. We're conservative because we're lazy. And it is a lot of work to revise all of the diagrams in the textbooks to include Homo naledi so that the undergraduates are thinking about the import of this. And it's a lot of work to revise the figure that you want to use in your publication because you want to show the brain size evolution over time. And, oh, I've got to add this other thing to it and it changes the way that it looks. And I can just ignore that thing for now because they're still working on it. And we don't, after all, know for sure that it belongs here, right? So there's an element of this that is a conservatism that comes out of laziness. But I think that the bigger picture is through the 1990s and early 2000s, our field fought a battle that was centered around how diverse the hominin record was going to be. At the early part of that time, there were serious folks who said there was only ever one species for most of this time. And if there was branching, it was just branching into Paranthropus, maybe, this very different, dietary niche. And humans are basically the same thing. And the other side of that was, no, there's endless forms of hominins and lots of different things, and we're finding new ones. And this was a battle, right? The battle hardened along lines that resemble stamp collecting, right? We found something new. Well, what does it mean? Well, Kenyanthropus platyops, we're not totally sure. It might change the form of the tree. This might be an ancestor of humans, but we're not sure. And that continued on until Australopithecus sediba, really, where you had discoveries of new things and the story that the press was putting out And our field was debating was how diverse is the tree? Homo naledi is a discovery that fundamentally changes the terms of that conversation by saying, wait a minute, we have these very different forms that are actually in contact with each other, and this is a problem. And we have to revise the way that we think that things are happening. And that includes the tie between behavior and brain size. It includes the tie between diet and the evolution of brain size, right? Naledi with its tiny teeth and its tiny brain, right? That's a combination that wasn't supposed to go together. And so it's very difficult for folks to unpack these things that were supposed to have gone together. And that creates, I think, sort of a brain freeze for people. Like, I don't know how to put this into the record. And so I'm going to treat this as this special case, something that's very separate.
So I'll be even a little stronger than John was there, in the sense that I think papers shouldn't be published if they're on the Middle Pleistocene and don't include Naledi. I think it's almost a form of alteration and falsification of existing data. And we see it a lot. If you'll see papers published, John mentioned brain size papers, but morphological papers that will actually exclude Naledi, even if they're discussing African fossils from the late Middle Pleistocene. In doing that, and I think it's unscientific, and I think it should stop. And I think it's being driven by the things that John touched upon and other things. One is that to emphasize how dogmatized our field was, that it got the story of quote unquote human evolution correct, how it got that right. It thought, if I gave a lecture 20 years ago, heck, if I gave a lecture 15 years ago, we would have talked about thoroughbred out of Africa. We would have known how the thing worked. We would have known this long pattern of big brains. All those, we would sit and tell everyone, oh, evolution doesn't happen like a t-shirt. And then we taught it in every classroom as if it were that t-shirt model of progression of brain size over time. And it's what things like Naledi, Flores started this. It started the sort of puncturing of the bubble of certainty that we had. And I think, in my opinion, Sadiba helped with that. Naledi should just plow over the idea of that humans have a very clean, easy to understand evolution if you're just asking about how we got here. And Naledi may very well have to. How does anyone know? And when you're not including that, right now, we've not released any molecular data on that, but whether Naledi shows a molecular contribution to living populations or not, or whether it contributed in the past, it has to be considered within the greater dynamics of the adaptations of hominids that are occurring not only in Africa, but across the planet. I can also say it signals this, and I think this draws a great fear, and it's one that John didn't touch on. I think the archaeologists are driving a lot of the fear of this. And the reason the archaeologists are is because, we built an idea of association of temporal archaeology on a big picture with species in parallel with it. If I read another paper that says, Homo erectus did the Acheulean, and yet there is almost no example of a Homo erectus, sensu stricto, or even lato that is associated with the Acheulean directly in that sense. And yet, if that, and so suddenly when Naledi comes along at a critical moment in the late Middle Pleistocene, remember, this is the moment that 15 or 20 years ago, we said, this is the moment that we as a community said that this is the moment that some miracle begins to happen, that the human mind begins to emerge, and we will see over the next 150,000 years the emergence of all these critical behaviors like burial, art, symbolic things, and all the big myriad of things that spill off of that. Naledi threatens your easy ability to do that, because I've said this in the literature, I know John has too, and others, that, how do you know that Naledi didn't make the early Middle Stone Age? And there's no reason, because we actually don't have a single well-dated hominid in subequatorial Africa that's a large-brained hominid, not a well-dated. that you would hang yourself over the date of it. And so, Naledi may be the only thing in that critical time period. For all we know right now, that's at least a hypothesis. That Naledi phobia that emerges in making it dirty and unclean is actually, something that needs to stop now, and we need to include Naledi in all of these studies, because, if it alters the studies to the point that the hypotheses don't stand, it's the hypotheses that need to be altered. You can't get rid of Naledi right now.
Well, given that, I mean, right now we're in this moment where there's this incredible work sort of recasting the broad cluster populations we call Neanderthals, right? Because of both archaeological and molecular data. We've got the Denisovans, who we don't really know who they are, but we can say a good deal about them. We have obviously the Floresiensis, the Flores specimens. What is it about, though, Naledi? Think about this, because not everyone has sort of plowed through all of the literature. And one could just say, okay, well, Lee, you opened by saying Naledi is primitive, which, here's one of these places we disagree, right? You can call these Naledi seems to be characterized by what look like our ancestral characters, but I would hesitate to call something at that time period primitive. So what is it? What are the things that we can talk about here that drove me to be very interested in the role Naledi might play in this broader mid-Pleistocene context? I think people recognize small brain, but that's not all that's about the crania, right? Or about the shoulder girdle, or about the limbs. Do you guys want to summarize why this is such an important set of fossils, not to mention an enormous number of fossils, most of which are available?
So I'll start with that, Augustine, because I think that's a great, sort of thing to leap off of, is that, we're a comparative field. And anything that we do in any part of human origins, we need to contextualize it in the context of the entire tree and the evidence that we have across the tree. And we're a data poor field. There are many discoveries that are super important to us that we only have, a partial cranium, or we only have a mandible. And so, making use of all of the evidence that exists is really important to us. That's one reason why we share all of the evidence that we publish and just put it out there so that people can have their own copies of this and can integrate it into their own analyses. Homo naledi is a fossil sample that at the moment we have, by my count, a minimum number of at least 25 individuals from published 4 contexts within the Rising Star Cave system, and that represents the entire skeleton in many individuals. We know more about the postcranial anatomy of Homo naledi than we know about Homo erectus. We know almost as much in terms of sample size about the dentition of Homo naledi as we know about Homo erectus, right? This is a massive sample, and it's one that gives us a tremendous amount of information that is not available in other fossil samples. And so that's a super important element of this, that here's a big thing. I do not think that Homo naledi is unique. Homo naledi is a fossil sample that we discovered 8 years ago, and that has, tremendously interesting things about it. But I think that there are probably many equivalent discoveries waiting for us. And so I don't want to leave the impression that this is a uniquely interesting thing that we're never going to find a parallel of. It's a thing that provides us an enormous amount of evidence that has to be integrated into what we do. That being said, it recombines features that we've seen in other parts of human origins in the tree in a way that we haven't seen before. And that gives us a way of testing hypotheses about the mechanisms by which these are connected in evolutionary time. The other thing that's really interesting and important about Naledi is that we find it in a setting that, regardless of what you think about, about levels of evidence that you want for demonstrating ancient behavior, is undeniably a cultural setting. This is incredibly rare for us to find any skeletal evidence of hominins that are in a setting that is unquestionably cultural, that implies that their behavior was structured in a way that we can recognize by studying the context that they're in. And so that's a big, big piece of this, that we've got this unique little place that is giving us a lot of evidence that's multidimensional. And that's a really important element of this.
And I think to also more directly answer your question, Augustine, there are really some odd features that need to be pointed to in Homo naledi. I used the word primitive at the time, I think, when we announced it, and that was because that was generally the cry of what most people saw. Because if you looked at the head from 10 feet away, it was as small as a Homo habilis. It was developing a flattened face. It had supraorbital tori like a little Homo erectus, and but the brain shape and certainly the back of the cranium and other aspects of it, are almost uniquely shared with humans, Homo sapiens, and not with a single extinct form of hominid, including archaic Homo sapiens. I mean, that there are things like that. The teeth you've mentioned, they are very small, which was viewed as a critical point, would have indicated all kinds of things like fire and meat eating and all those things until it was discovered in Homo naledi, and then it didn't mean that anymore. And but their morphology is not like that of a modern human in any, or Homo sapiens in any way. It has, in fact, what you would consider a more ancient sort of tooth patterning, and then a lot of unique features. The shoulders are I remember when David Green was first studying them, he said they're about as close to a gibbon as I've ever seen in a hominid sample. But then as you extend out the limbs, both from the pelvis, below the pelvis downward towards the feet and towards the hands, it becomes more and more human-like, with some strange exceptions, like being almost superhuman in its thumb length, well, at least being in very high percentages of variability in its thumb length relative to its other hands, and having very curved phalanges. Its vertebral column shares features with Neanderthals, interestingly, but very tiny. It does seem to have a conical shaped thorax, though, and its pelvis looks like more similar to an Australopithecine, and that's mirrored in its proximal femur neck lengths and things like that. But then it gets more human-like as it passes down to a relatively very human foot. And so it is a weird combination. I think it is and I don't disagree. I don't agree that it wouldn't have been cataloged as primitive in its overall bowel plan by most scientists. But again, just to touch on what John said, because our entire science was based on scraps. And I mean, really, I think at the time that Naledi was discovered, how many partial skeletons, and we are ridiculous in our use of that. That's like any part of the body associated with any part of the head of an individual that we have. There probably were a dozen of them in the entire African record, if we're lucky. And now that's not true. And by the way, John and I weren't disagreeing in numbers. I said more than 40, he said 25. That's just because we've left a lot in there, and there have been new discoveries that aren't released yet, that if you add those numbers, there's a lot more hominids in there. And we've left a lot for your generation to dig out and look at. That's part of our principle, is leaving them there, so technology and your generation can ask questions, and we're not destroying all the evidence as we make these discoveries.
Can I ask a question? Sorry,
Marta, what we're going to do at the end, Marta, what we're going to do, we're going to have time at the end to ask questions, so that we're going to do a second series of questions, and then we'll take question time. Okay. And I think we'll be happy to go over time if we want. I know we started a little bit late, to answer as many questions as we can. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think that reads to John.
Yeah, I want to pick up this question of primitive versus human, because I feel like this is an area on which you and Augustin don't, maybe see things the same way. And what I'd like to do is ask you, we have come through 150 years of understanding human origins progressively better. And a part of that story is what's happened with Neanderthals, and our initial belief that the Neanderthals are something that is insuperably different from us, to today's sort of kind of acceptance that they're human in really important ways, and maybe they're just human, and maybe actually there's distinctions that make them not exactly human. With Naledi, I want to know, why aren't they human, right? Are we not going to go through some similar phase of coming to understand their behavior in a way that makes us recognize that, basically they're human in some important way?
So I'm going to take that first, because John is deliberately poking me on that, I think, initially, because I take the very strong stance that you're going to have to drag me kicking and screaming into the world where I allow the Academy to call Homo naledi human. And the reason for that is there's no darn definition of human. Look it up in the Oxford Dictionary, or Cambridge doesn't have a dictionary, I don't think, but Webster's or any of the others. The definition of human is something ridiculous like having the character of people. Or a person, or, what is that? That's circular. And it shows the arrogance to which we have dealt with the idea of, we know what's human and we know what's not. Look at the way we talk about human evolution as if it were some purpose-built thing to make us exist, as opposed to being interesting and dynamic at any time in the past. I am going to start with this, and then I'll move to two. I think that Naledi is not human because it doesn't fit what we have sat for 150 years as discussing. It does not have the character of people. It's not in our grade. It doesn't have our brain. It doesn't have our shoulders. It's not interacting with the world. The only thing it pretty much shares with us in any real sense is, if you saw it at 200 meters, you'd think it's one of us, because we haven't had the privilege of having other things on this planet with us. And so anything that's biped, we capture into our sphere. So from a morphological basis, I think Homo naledi it's being good at being Naledi in its environment, and it's doing it, and what Naledi does in its environment isn't what this so-called thing that we are today. And I think that, as you mentioned, Neanderthals, they are. Homo erectus, if I actually knew what that was, I'd say that some of them are, and I don't think everything we call a Homo erectus is a Homo erectus, because I think that the reason that exists, that we're doing that, is, again, this problem of making it easy for the archaeologists, because we didn't have the idea that multiple species could exist, and we had this arrogance that every time a thing with a bigger brain came along, that everything with a smaller brain that existed prior to it went extinct. That didn't happen. I think Naledi does, at least in part, come from a deeper ancestry. You can't do it. Maybe one that goes back 2.5 million plus years of either separation or separation with some introgression through time. I'm not going to let you throw in behavior and technology, because right now, without a definition of human and without that being in play, humans do everything. And humans do everything as individuals, whether different groups of them, and they have through time, whether individuals with different capacity do things differently. There is no way humans do everything. So that's that. If that's your definition of humans, then everything's a human that does any part of that. We don't have that culture yet, but I don't think that's going to happen, John, unless I get forced. Your idea that we get pulled into the idea like Neanderthals. Unless, because by pulling Naledi in, then what humans have done is they've created an untestable basket of that definition. And by the way, why is the term human important? Because I gave you lay definitions of it, which aren't that lay. It's crept into the scientific literature and being used by archaeologists and paleoanthropologists all the time as if it is defined and as if it means something. And I'm saying, well, whatever it means, Naledi's not in it. Augustine.
So thanks for teeing that up, Lee. So, we agree and disagree on a bunch of these things. And I think the core disagreement here is something that you actually sort of laid out, and that is how we define the human is highly problematic and constantly changing. We used what John said, which I agree. I just like the term anatomically modern human. Right? People have come up with a variety of different names for that. The problem is the morphological definition is going to fall by the wayside as we learn more and more, given the kind of variation we see in the genus Homo. I'm much more interested, though, in considering the possibility that Naledi is human in the context of the human niche, right? And so I think there is a whole range of behavioral processes that are evidenced by ecological and material remains alongside considerations of the morphological remains that suggest, and many people in the audience here have written on this, that suggest that there are patterns and processes that emerge, right, in this sort of middle and later Pleistocene that seem to be sort of that zone, right, that the niche, this sort of evolutionary ecological dynamic that characterizes humans today, right? Now, whether Naledi would be considered a human like you and I think that is actually problematic. And there's where we come into the problem of the term human. I like the term human niche, but I would push and argue that Naledi are certainly people. They may not be people like us, but I think John gave this nod to something that I think has become very evident. And that is that this rising star system, right, this cave system is a cultural system, a system that has been sort of co-created through Naledi, potentially others, and their dynamics with the material environment and with the sort of ecological dynamics. And that's something I think that's come out already with the published data on Naledi, particularly the more recent sort of reviews or overviews of the cave and stuff that's going to be coming out. But I think this idea that we have a hominin, ostensibly a member of the genus Homo, doing really complex things socially, ecologically, behaviorally, in a very distinctive environment, an environment that's highly problematic for primates in general, and doing a lot there. Now, we've seen this sort of use of caves, I think, by the members of genus Homo increasingly, right? And some of our best data, right, comes from there. All of the Atapuerca data, the recent last decade's worth of really interesting evidence of Neanderthal manipulation, Bunnequell and other places. The bottom line here that I would say is that I think there is a niche that is occupied by multiple members of the genus Homo in this middle and terminal Pleistocene, that is a zone of evolutionary adaptation and experimentation that Naledi fits snugly into. I think Naledi fits in that space. And we've had this debate before, but I think what's really important and what's new here, right, is this argument that we need to, as John and as many others have said, we need to move away from some anatomical boundary that becomes crossed, whether that's brain size or particular other features of morphology that make sort of the human success story that we are today. And I think more in this sort of evolutionary dynamic that has multiple populations, potentially multiple species, multiple subspecies, who knows, all sort of working within this frame, of which, right, we're the only one left. But as you nodded to the really increasingly important molecular data, we know that in an evolutionary sense, we are not alone, right, even in our own bodies.
So I'm not gonna let morphology go. I'm not going to let it go that easily with you. When you've got skeletons, and we're beginning to build that in many of these species, we can see what their whole bioplan was. We can see what their adaptive niche was. And I'm not going to let 150 years of exploration of the association of biology and morphology to behavior and environment just be thrown out the window, because I think the real danger of talking about a human niche is it's insulting to Naledi. It's acting as if whatever it does uniquely and whatever it has built in its survival is somehow mimicking this infinite toolkit or this universal behaviors. And so I don't like it, but we don't have to agree on that.
I just want to jump in and say I kind of feel like there is a middle ground that you're dancing around, right? We have, for maybe as long as I've been in the field, you hear people talking about Australopithecus as a bipedal ape. And there is a magic to that metaphor, right? Because it frames your mind in a different way when you start thinking about something as an ape, as opposed to something like a human. But that is also a dangerous and not very helpful metaphor to understand what behavior actually was. And I think there is room to explore the idea that, maybe today's people are in some ways in a Naledi niche, or maybe there are other things, right? Other ways of living that our ancestors and relatives have had that that are as different from each other as we are from chimpanzees, or as chimpanzees are from gorillas, or as, right? So, I don't want to constrain the way that we think about or imagine the past, right? Because I think we're discovering these things, and there's so much more to discover.
So that's the point with, when I said Naledi are people, right? Naledi are doing people things. They're not people like us, but they are doing people-like things. And I think thinking about the Middle Pleistocene emerging patterns of these very different populations, potentially different species, experimenting and working through a lot of overlapping possibilities with very different bodies, I think that's actually really interesting.
Yeah, Augustine, before I ask my question, I'll just conclude with the problem with using people is that it's probably, if you look the definition up, I haven't, it's probably having the characteristic of humans is probably the definition of it. Maybe we should just throw human and people out of the scientific literature and not use it in our discourses like this as we gather more evidence. So I have the final one, and then we'll open for questions, and it's not going to be a long one. It's a pretty easy one. One of the most exciting things for me these journeys of discovery, as I've been very privileged to be involved in now multiple discoveries of hominids and other things, and there's new ones that haven't been announced yet that we're working on, that is the joy that the open access experience has brought to me personally, the idea of opening science up. And I came from a very non-traditional background, and since that I didn't go to a tier 1 school, and it was very unusual to be on the inside if you weren't either, sort of genetically linked to a professor who'd been through those more elite schools. I came out of a different area, and when I entered this field, I was horrified to see the lack of transparency, the lack of data being published, the inability to test anything. You literally couldn't test what someone published, and still can't sometimes in some cases, because it was almost as if it were a belief system, and it horrified me. But it took me till my first major discovery, Sediba, to actually implement on a large scale the idea that our field's got to operate like other fields of science, and its data has to be accessible, or it's not a science. And I've taken a very strong stance on that. I know it's a little bit radicalized, and took the sort of knocks for those in the early days, surprisingly. But John, you've been on that journey. One of the reasons that you and I started working together, many people may not know this, is because, I kind of sought you out for that reason, as to be in developing more strategic ideas around this prior to the discovery of Naledi, on how we might handle the next discovery better than we did Sediba and the open access. And then Augustine, you've been parallel to that, and then now engaged in our project deeply. I want to know the benefits beyond those that are kind of obvious of open access, and some of the things that maybe aren't so positive in the way that we operate that right now. John first, maybe?
Yeah. So, I think a lot of people know that I started in paleoanthropology and transitioned largely into genetics, and it was precisely around this. In the 1990s, and many of you were there, it was very difficult to formulate new projects for a PhD in paleoanthropology and work around the limitations on data that you could access. There were many collections in many places in the world where I was welcomed, where it was wonderful. To the curators and the other scientists in different countries were just amazing, and you could work on things, and it as a professional, right? But it was accessible for professionals. And there were other places where it was absolutely inaccessible, where if you were not the right person with the right connections, if you were not a student of the right people, if you were not, if you didn't have something to trade that somebody else wanted, you were just not going to see the fossil record. You weren't going to see material. And it made me into a geneticist. I was like, there's this field that is generating data that is millions of orders of magnitude greater than what we're generating in the fossil record. And it's all openly available. You can download it and you can do new studies. And who wins in this field is who has the best ideas and who is making use of the funding that is generously given by governments around the world for this. It was really Lee that dragged me back, in the sense that, I was the weirdest geneticist who had these fossils, copies of fossils everywhere, and was certainly teaching on the fossil record and was looking for integration of these things. But the possibility of working on original fossil material, was not real for people like me. until the last couple of, maybe 12 or 13 years. So it was really formative and important for me to become involved in this. There are challenges to it. We're working in a field that is heritage, and heritage belongs to all the people on Earth, but it is the unique province of the countries where heritage is discovered to be the guardians of that heritage and the custodians of it. And it is very important in our field to be able to develop the economies and develop the human capital and develop ways for people to participate in their heritage. And that is a challenge in a field that is globally underfunded, and where there are real inequities between countries in their funding of science and their funding of careers. And creating jobs and creating opportunities for people is incredibly important to us. We have seen in our work that creating open access has allowed us to leverage discoveries in ways that create opportunities. And that is really important to our work, but it is not easy to see the connections. And it is a tough conversation to have sometimes with heritage authorities, with governments, to say, if you're participating in this system, you're going to benefit from this, right? We've seen the benefits in our own work. We've seen the way that it creates tourism opportunities, that it creates scientific opportunities, that it does things that would not be possible otherwise. But it's a different way of thinking, and it is really hard sometimes to show how that way of thinking, is going to work in practice. It leaves people behind. One concern that folks have with open access is that if you're going to release the data that you have, you make it possible for many other people around the world to work on high quality, high resolution data. You've got to work fast yourself, because they're going to publish, they have good ideas too. This is true in genetics, and putting your data online before publication is the routine in human genetic work. But there are many labs that don't benefit from that system, because there's lots of other labs that have really smart people and really good ideas and can leverage things, right? So if you don't put into practice the professional system that allows people's careers to grow, to advance, so that the system is working as a whole, then it can be a challenge to make open access work. So there are, we love to have people printing out our fossils and showing them in classrooms around the world. That is really important to me personally, and it's important to South African science for this to be leading the way. But there are challenges to it, and I think people should think really hard about supporting open access by using the data that we put out, by making sure that it's used in all studies, and by making sure that studies that are published on this area of science are required to include this stuff. Because if you allow people to not use it, they can get away with not providing their own data. And that, to me, is the lesson for folks who are professionals around the world, to say, is it really necessary for them to include this in their study? The answer is, if you let them not include it, then they can get away with not providing their own evidence.
I'll just jump on really quickly, because we want to leave time for Q&A, and just to acknowledge and draw on a word that John mentioned there, integration. I think one of the most important things for me joining the very, very large and dynamic and diverse team of scholars working on Naledi, many of whom are actually in the audience here, was this possibility for an integration that moves sort of human evolutionary studies into a transdisciplinary frame, where it's not just people who understand, let's say, skeletal morphology or molecular processes or paleoarchaeology or a variety of other things, which are central. Those are the central sort of, or geology, the centers, traditional centers in human evolutionary studies, but also a wide variety of other folks, behavioral ecologists, primatologists, right? Cultural anthropologists, people who work in ecological dynamics. The whole notion that we have the capacity and the intellectual proficiency to engage in a kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary engagement with reconstructing this broad story of human evolution or hominin evolution, whatever we want to call it. I think we can do it better now than we ever have been. And open access to the materials from different places around the planet is central today, to not work collaboratively across continents and across countries and across landscapes and across universities is really important. I'll just say at the end, I'm very privileged to be at a very well-funded, well-structured university, but that shouldn't grant me access and not grant others access to some of these basic materials. And so I echo what Lee and John both said, that this sort of the open access model in human evolution and the opportunity for interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity is a central draw. And I think it's going to get us at much better understandings in human evolution in the long run. But we should probably go to questions, correct?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, I guess, thank you both for that. And thanks for the conversation. I guess we'll turn it over to Georgina to handle and moderate questions as they come in.
Yep, thank you so much, all of you. It was a really interesting discussion. So if anybody has any questions, you can either send them directly to me or raise your hand and I will go through and try and spot you, and you just unmute your mic. Okay, we've got some hands. Clement, do you want to go and ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. It was an interesting talk, and actually I was very interested in all the discussion on primitive features, or so-called primitive features. Actually, except maybe the back of the neurocranium, I can't find any single typical feature of Homo in Homo naledi. I mean, the teeth for me are looking like stridopit, the rib cage also, the hip bone, the curved phalanges, everything. So I was wondering, have you ever considered the possibility that it's not Homo?
Yeah, John, I'll take a little bit of that. I was gonna jokingly go after Augustine in answer to his question when he said, well, all these members of the genus Homo in the Pleistocene, and I was about to say, well, why don't we just take it out of Homo then? It's like, then how does that fit into that comment of the human niche? But the answer is yes. And I'll tell you this, this isn't inside baseball, I guess, if that's a term that people understand around the world. We've drafted papers that argue that, and then considered submitting them at times that discuss that. Genera have kind of the same problem of definition as the word term human does. There's almost not one. I mean, there is and there isn't. It depends on people argue about it. And so, there is a point where you say, does it really matter? It might matter in something like Naledi, depending on what its root is and where. And the beauty of Naledi is I think we will have all those answers at some point in the not distant future. We really will know a great deal about those, and with real answers, not just hypotheses that are loose based on what we think, but on molecular data and other things like that. So yes, the short answer is yes, we have considered that many times, including during the initial description. John, you jump in on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, we debated this, and what it came down to was that Naledi exhibited clear similarities with humans in 3 areas that had historically been considered as fundamental to the definition of the genus, right? Those 3 areas were locomotion in terms of the way it moved, the manipulation, the way that it could handle and use its hands to manipulate its environments, and dentition, right? And that's the size and function of its teeth. Within each of those areas, there are elements that it's similar to earlier hominins. And so each of those created a debate for us, right? Is this Homo-like or not? Now, unfortunately, there are many earlier species of Homo where you don't have the relevant evidence. So we can't compare the wrist of Naledi to the wrist of Erectus, for example. The wrist of Naledi is derived compared to the wrist of Floresiensis, right? And so accepting Floresiensis within Homo sort of gave us, right, a real hesitation of putting Naledi outside of it. But as we thought about it, we came down to, what? People have historically thought of Homo in this way. If we accept that definition, then Naledi belongs in our genus. And that defines the genus in the sense that If Naledi is within the genus, then the genus is the common sort of the branch that includes as a deepest node today's humans and Naledi. We might make further discoveries that cause us to replace that, to put it in another place. But at the moment, that's where we landed.
Thanks.
So Sean, did you want to ask your question?
You're muted, John.
Can I make a comment or two relating to what we just talked about instead of asking a question? If you look at the endocast and you look at the frontal lobes, I can list 3 ways in which it doesn't just look Homo, it looks modern human. And then we were talking about brain size. We really have to separate when we say brain size. Okay, so human brains don't look like chimpanzee brains or Australopithecine brains because our neocortex is, the cortex is growing relative to the white matter. Okay. And that doesn't happen when our brains get big. That happens when we're in the womb and we have brains the size of chimpanzees or smaller. Okay, so our brains sort of look like chimps at the beginning, during early gestation, and then they change while we're still in the womb, right? And Naledi looks like that. So Lee asked me when we were doing the work, "Are you saying this looks almost human?" And I said, "I didn't say anything about almost." Okay, and it's not. Okay, I said it looks human. Now, and you can say it has a brain size, that's like small, but it's neocortex. I mean, it gets that morphology by having a larger neocortex relative to its size than a chimp's. So its neocortex is larger than a chimp's, even if it's the same chimp size. And the other thing to remember is, so when we think of, like our human brains and we all do logic and everything. Well, I mean, I do logic, okay, but I'm a geek. How many people do logic every day? Okay, yes, we can do logic, but so much of what makes us human is affective rather than higher cognitive, or maybe higher affective, right? It's like where affect and like cognition sort of meet. And that's why, the great apes, even though they have brain sizes that are very similar, are quite different, because let's say the orbitofrontal cortex is different, even though their brain sizes are the same. Okay, well, and the Naledi's orbitofrontal cortex is going to be different because of obviously of those changes that tie into Broca's language area. Okay, so when you look at the neurobiology of meaning and morality, so much of that is affective, and maybe it's higher affective and not like deeply, like in the deep part of the brain. But a lot of what makes us human, Naledi very well could have been capable of. I mean, I don't like, from my point of view as a neuroscientist, morphology does not stand in our way. As a matter of fact, morphology is on our side. When you consider, it isn't, how many things you consider meaningful, but what it is that you consider. I mean, chimpanzees versus bonobos versus gorillas versus orangutans find different things meaningful, right? And I mean, if you look at morality is a whole bunch of affect with a little bit of cognition sprinkled over the top. Meaning is a little bit of cognition that then kicks in a whole bunch of affect. Okay, so I mean, just going from affects, like the Naledi very well could be there. It's overall brain size. I won't say brain size because that's driving me crazy. Everyone says, "Oh yeah, brain size." No, okay, yeah, its white matter volume does not compare to mine. Okay, no shocker. But it just from as a neuroscientist, from an aspect of affect and morphology, there's nothing standing in Naledi's way. Anyway, that's my
John, your definition of morality just caused like 50% of the world's philosophers to flip over and pass out. But that's okay though, because I sort of agree. There's something really good there.
Okay, Dylan, did you want to ask your question?
Absolutely. So, well, first of all, Sean, thank you so much for your insight as someone who's worked with fossils, and thanks to all of our speakers for accepting our invitation. I did want to return to the point of genera, because I know that Doctors Berger and Hawks have been involved in a discussion over the Naledi-Guraru mandible going back 2.8 million years, the earliest, well, purportedly the earliest member of Iridius Homo. So I wanted to ask, concerning taxonomic philosophy, should the presence of derived traits place fossils such as Naledi-Guraru, such as Sediba, and such as Naledi within the genus Homo, or should we be thinking more about the presence of primitive traits?
So I'll start, and I think John will answer more deeply on this, but I'll give you superficially because I was obviously intimately involved with the decisions on placing Sediba, for example, in the genus Australopithecus. And I don't mean to undermine the importance of the utilization of genus. And these words have real meaning, and we think about them very deeply. And none of that was done lightly. That when we did Naledi and when we did Sediba, I don't think here's the big problem. I don't think you've got enough of Ledi Gararu to say hardly anything about it. I don't think there's enough there to say what John and I said was you can't differentiate it from Sediba based on what you have. And that wasn't saying it isn't what they say it is. It's saying that it's not enough evidence. And, we are going to get a stage where I hope that this, either our group or your generation as it comes forward somehow throws all of what we've done because in defining species and genera and fossils out the window and can start fresh. I know that is probably a pipe dream at this stage until our field advances one funeral at a time. Is not necessarily a deep joke in this situation, but we need to as we do discover a more complete record, we need to acknowledge that a record that was built not only on inadequate evidence and inadequate idea that, the first thing found is a type or however it played out in a situation, but that we have to acknowledge that we didn't have enough evidence when making those decisions and those choices, and that there should be at some point an evidentiary line drawn, and then things that can't meet it don't and then spend a great deal of money and exercise empowering you guys to get out in the field and find more evidence in those areas that we don't have adequate evidence in, because it contaminates the fossil record. The idea, have any of you ever done this exercise in your courses? And it's well worth doing. If not allowing the fossil record to be built by the coincidence of when the fossil was found and how it then if we hear again how this fossil rewrites the history of human evolution as a new one comes along. They've said that since the Tongchow, and it's and we need to consider that very carefully as we suddenly, when John, Augustine, and I, and others in this audience entered this field, we thought there was never going to be more fossils, that it was an ever declining area, and that we were going to work on scraps. And I am not kidding, as I've said and joking in many lectures I give. At the late 90s and early 2000s, my dream was to find a single half of a hominid mandible because I could dine out at cocktail parties at conferences for the rest of my life. We have colleagues who did that. And and now that's not true. That scarcity myth, and it was a scarcity myth, was very damaging. It cut funding for exploration. We know that there are worlds to find out there, and we need to get more people out there looking. And that's part of the problem. So I kind of rambled off on a different track there, but John?
I'm privileged in my life at the moment that I've spent more time actually trying to find fossils by walking around in places where fossils are than I've spent thinking about what a genus is. And I think more people should take the opportunity to do this. I feel that, when we talk about a genus, that words have meaning, and meanings are important, and I don't want to minimize this, but we today are talking about 2 species of gorillas living in the world today, and each of them with 2 subspecies. We're talking about 2 species of pan, with one of them having 4 deep subspecies within it. We today recognize 3 species of orangutans living in the world, and 2 or 3 fossil species of orangutans within the genus Pongo. We know something about species diversity and genus diversity in primates. Much conversation about what genus things should be in the fossil record of hominins occurs without any consideration of any of this, right? If we're biologists, we should be using our knowledge of nature to inform the way that we use these words. And I don't know exactly, right, where I would fall on this, But if you said to me, John, wouldn't it be reasonable to do what Morris Goodman said and to put all of these into Homo? I would say, you know, it would save us a lot of this mindless conversation about what a genus is.
Marta, did you want to ask your question from earlier?
Yes, I sort of want to argue with you guys with everything you say. I'll leave my question for a minute. I want to say, I think a couple of things about what you've just said. So I was just thinking, could we throw everything into Homo? And I think that we would actually make a mess of it. We will lose one of our mechanisms of telling or trying to understand what the different creatures are doing. I was also thinking of what you were saying, Lee, and saying that all these narratives were built without the appropriate data. And it's true. But on the other hand, we need the narratives. The narratives are the hypotheses. Right. So people have to produce them, and then you have half a finger and then say, well, I think my half finger resolves everything. But perhaps not believe them, no? So that is the key bit. You know, you come up with these ideas and these narratives, and then people get completely stuck and they defend them as if they were the true meaning of life. And that's the surprising bit. One last comment, and then I'll ask you my question. And the last comment is about at the beginning, when you were talking about why Naledi has not become part of the conversation on the Middle Pleistocene. And you know, I live in the Middle Pleistocene. It's my spot. And it's surprising. It's quite incredible. And I think that partly, and I even watch now the conversations about, you know, braided streams and everybody mixing and so on. But they don't really mean Naledi, right? So it's like everybody else. It's all of Africa blending, unless you're not like a human. And so we are in a conceptual mess about it. And there is a serious, I think that when you come to people, there's the idea that evolution has progressed and has directionally led to us is still entrenched. And it's very, very difficult to get rid of it. So somehow, by the time, even if you have them, Naledis, Floresienses, they're on the side, it doesn't matter, right? We can talk about the story of people as if those with whom they share the spaces cannot be part of that story because they don't fit. So I think it's a huge issue. I mean, we have talked briefly about this before. It's a huge issue about our understanding of body size, behavior, ecology, adaptation in the last million that is completely sidelined. So bring on the fossils. I'm going to ask my question finally, because I remember John showing me. I mean, tell us something, or tell the students here something about diversity or lack thereof in Naledi. Because I think it's one of the most striking aspects of this super represented taxon.
John,
okay, well, I'll pick up that question. So when we look at the teeth of Naledi from all of the contexts where we found Naledi and have described them, they have relatively low variation in tooth sizes and tooth morphology across these across now, you know, more than a dozen individuals where you can compare the same tooth in many individuals. And it's low variation. It's lower than we find in any other species of hominins that I can think of. We don't really have a comparable sample for most hominids, you know, that many individuals from one site, but our variation is lower than Cimodilus huesos, where we do have that many individuals. It's lower than Crapina. So it has, you know, low dental size variation. Morphologically, in the postcranial skeleton, the things that we find that are unusual, that we noticed as being, this is unusual in this Naledi metacarpal, are shared by other Naledi metacarpals. So to the extent that we can compare, this is a low variability sample morphologically. There is variation. There's variation in cranial size. There's variation in features that I would think in adults that are related to skeletal sex. It's kind of a normal population in that sense, right? So the extent to which the sample is telling us something about morphology, it's telling us that the variability is kind of low. In other contexts, people have asked, does this mean that they were inbred? And when we see Neanderthal samples, sometimes the ones that exhibit strange skeletal sort of non-metric features, that have deflected sutures, that have things where you look at it and you're like, there's some sort of disordered development that's happening. And we think that this may actually be inbreeding. And we have genetics, so we know that there's low genetic variation. They're exhibiting variability of a kind that we don't see in the Naledi sample. So, to that extent, it's not like we can look at variability and say, oh, yes, this means that they were genetically uniform. I think actually the opposite. I think that they're basically human-like in their genetic variation would be my prediction.
So I'd just like to add one just ending note to that, is that I think it's also important to remember we don't know if this is a population in the sense of a group of individuals that were directly related to each other in the same space in the same time. Based on that low variability, we sort of assumed it when we started working on them. And it was a heavy assumption, and John will attest to that, and other members of the team as we that are here that would attest to that, as we sort of kind of built that as a narrative, Marta, within our discourse. I'll say this. I suspect that we are going to have to be very careful about all of these situations and all of these individuals coming into that cave over a relatively short period of time. I think at some stage we may have to revise that. I'm not giving away anything when I say that. That is actually something that, but I suspect that we are going to have to be explaining that low variability that John described. And I think, Mark, you're touching, I think he's being unduly conservative. It's remarkably low variability for a group of fossils. Like that. You didn't mention Dmanisi, which is as well, but that I think we should be prepared in our conversation not to just buy into that internal narrative that because they all look alike, they all came in there at the same time. And I think that may speak possibly at some point in the future to this wide-held assumption in paleoanthropology that these species have to change dramatically if they exist for long periods of time. And I would suggest that we should. That's one of the beauties of something like the Naledi. It just makes us question all of these things deeply, these held beliefs. And I think, and the lovely thing is, because it is relatively close to us in time, most of these we will be able to test in a relatively sound way. Augustine, you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just think that's really important because having been lucky enough to look at a lot of the teeth, for example, recently, the similarities are shocking, but there are other patterns and sort of elements in the sort of different morphological collections there that I think are very similar, but that might not be just reflective of a genetic or a morphological continuity, but actually some cultural and behavioral continuities. And that, I think, because of the sheer number of overlapping, right, of the same pieces of morphology from different individuals, I think we'll be able to continue to ask those kinds of questions, to think about how Naledi lived in ways that are going to be very, very fruitful.
So Georgina, I think maybe we can do two more questions and then have sort of closing statements from that if we did. I just want to say that, just reflecting, I think that you're hearing all of us allude that we really have some very interesting discoveries that are going to give us deep insight into behavior, into technology, into other areas. I'm sure that's the worst kept secret on the planet. And some of them are very, very exciting and will give us very deep. I mean, John's already used the word culture, which you'll notice that we've never spoken out loud before, or in any of our writing about Naledi, and it is coming. So a lot of this will be testable evidence in the future that you'll all have access to.
Okay, so Rob, did you want to ask your question? You might want to unmute. I think you're muted.
I always forget that bit. Well, thank you all for the really interesting discussion. And before I ask a question, I just want to sort of endorse what you said about open data. I think the move you made towards open access of material was really important, and we have to go in that direction. I want to go back to the discussion you had at the very beginning about, the history and sense the tension between multiple species in hominin evolution and a more sort of unilinear pattern. As you know, you probably know, I'm very much, let 1,000 species bloom is my philosophy. But I thought in your discussion, having said that, you kind of wanted to bring Naledi back into the middle of the story and put it close to this, the true line. And my question for you is, which would you prefer, or which would be more exciting? I know which I think would be more exciting. Naledi to be something really outlying, surviving late, Australopithecine, early Homo, something weird, or for it to be in the, as you occasionally hint, something to do with the origins of Homo sapiens. I know my views, but I obviously...
Okay, so I certainly didn't. I think each of us will have a similar and different answer to this. I certainly hope I didn't hint that I think it is or should be in the line to leading to humans. Whether you're going to find some small levels of introgression in Homo naledi with populations of it shows up in our DNAs of some people in the world today at levels that it wouldn't surprise me at all. Whether that has any real bearing on later things or not, I don't know. But I know my easy answer. Man, I would love it if Naledi had absolutely nothing to do with the molecular and origins of that, other than sharing a last common ancestor at somewhere deep in time, because I think it further emphasizes the other things I was saying about how dramatic Naledi should be in affecting the way we reevaluate all our sacred cows of technology, the origins of mind, the origins of behavior, the technological associations, the arrogance of the idea of extinction every time we build a better mousetrap type situation that evolution is full of. So, and John and Augustine and many people will attest, I've often said that, man, I would love Naledi not to be related to humans. I think that, and whether it is maybe an eternal and endless debate, if it does have small amounts of introgression, if it's species X, for example, the missing species in the DNA of some African humans that's there, that may not, John's the geneticist, he can talk more to, will that have any meaning or any impact on that or not? But that's my honest answer to your question. I think there's a real chance of it, by the way, Rob, being true. John, I'm sure you...
Yeah, I don't have any, in what way do we want to reframe so that Naledi is near the center of the story? Our story does have a center, and that story is Africa. The center is Africa. And we have a shockingly low knowledge of the diversity of African hominins in this really key time period. And whatever the story of our own species is, in terms of its time depth, in terms of its early diversity, in terms of the interactions that were necessary to generate the diversity that we see worldwide today, whatever that story is, it's a story that we used to think happened on the landscape where we just found Naledi. So in that sense, it is in the center of the story, but we didn't put it there. we were looking for what you hoped that we might find there, and we found something else.
If anything, Naledi might be elbowing or nudging these other folks off what we thought was the center stage, and recreating how we described it.
It was possible to approach this with Homo floresiensis and say, oh yeah, well, we know that that's not the center of the story. You know, it's hard to say that with anything that we find in Africa in this time period, right? Our story has to accommodate the diversity that's there. And that doesn't mean that the diversity is core within, you know, it's a pearl inside of human genetics, right? I wouldn't think that at all. I wonder whether there are connections, or whether, you know, notwithstanding whether we might be part Naledi, whether Naledi is in some large part us. And those are not the same question. But that's a scientific question, right? That's something that we just don't have data about right now that is interesting. I think the important thing about this is reframing the way we tell the story, is decentering ourselves and thinking of us as an element of past landscapes that we have imperfect evidence about. And the consequences of finding discoveries like this for enabling us to look at ourselves from a more objective point of view.
Thank you for that, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think
That's
that's
been
been
the whole history of humankind, though, right? I mean, the whole history of science has been like, the more we decenter ourselves, the more we come closer to the truth. You know, I think we're not the center of the universe. So
thank you for all the questions. I don't think we've got any more questions come in. And
Oh, good.
We just, yeah, it's thank you for staying for longer for the Q&A. It's been really great to hear you all discuss and hear everyone bounce off each other. And you know, we'd absolutely love to have you back on, you know, when new data is published.
It hopefully won't be very long.
We just wanted to point out that next week we've got another, just a little self-promo, that next week we've got another talk on Tuesday with Bernard Wood on interpreting the fossil record at the same time, 5 p.m. Just a reminder for everyone. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.